We just had to do a few run-throughs. Thank you very much for being here today. And I'm joined today by Mr. Werner Horn, who's the DA's Deputy Shadow Minister on Justice and Correctional Services. We're very lucky to have with us the leader of Dawn and MEC Norma French and Bombo from the Western Cape Provincial Government, and our spokesperson in the Presidency for Women, MP Nazli Sharif. In the recent weeks, the 19-year-old Uyanene Imrechania, 14-year-old Janika Mallo, and boxing champion Leandre Baby Lee Jeggles were among hundreds of women brutally raped and murdered in an often incomprehensibly cruel and evil fashion. They've joined a long list of the names of other women, Courtney Peters, Karabo Mokoena, Valencia Farmer, and Megan Kremer, who were failed by a society that ought to have protected them from harm instead of being preyed upon, and by a government that should have responded to the soaring number of sexual offences, abuse and femicide years ago. The tragic reality is simply this, that unless swift and decisive action is taken, history will keep on repeating itself, leaving many, many more women's names to join that tragic list. Last week's annual crime statistic release revealed a tragic national reality, which is that every day almost 114 people in South Africa report being raped. This is an increase of 3.9% of the year before. The overwhelming majority of these cases would have been women. Many more cases are likely to have remained unreported during that same period. Sexual offences against children in that period have increased by 3.8%. Women were the victims of 2/3 of all reported sexual offences, while children are the victims of nearly half of all reported sexual assault cases. What this country needs is urgent, clear and decisive action that goes further than jailing perpetrators and that addresses the root causes of the social and moral collapse. We also need strong leadership and direction in government, as well in the form of a parliament that listens to the crisis and makes effective legislative decisions. The party has already, through its leadership, written to the President for a bipartisan meeting to discuss solutions to the scourge of gender-based violence in South Africa. And we've called upon the President to establish a special task team to review the processes and systems of the country's law enforcement agencies, as well as the criminal justice system. We've written as well to the Minister of Police, requesting that he sends the draft Criminal Law Forensic Procedures Bill to Parliament as a matter of urgency. This draft bill will allow DNA samples to continue to be taken from convicted offenders in terms of Schedule 8 of the Criminal Procedure Act, and that obviously would include sexual offenders. This would ensure that the police service is able to speedily identify any repeat offences should these individuals be released back into society. There are currently no DNA samples recorded for over 46,000 convicted Schedule 8 offenders. The DIA further believes that the elimination of gender-based violence from our society must start with ourselves and at home, and that we hope that by restoring the sanctity of the home, we can lay the groundwork for eliminating violence and the general abuse of women from other domains of South African life. It is for this reason, but also because it is often the case that women or children are harmed in their own homes by those they love and trust, the most that we want to introduce legislative reforms to specifically address the occurrence of domestic abuse. We want to propose replacing the Domestic Violence Act, which will turn 20 years old this year and which is due now, given these circumstances, for an overhaul, as well as the Protection of Harassment Act, with a brand new holistic piece of legislation that's better suited to protect victims of interpersonal and domestic abuse. I'm going to hand over now to Werner Horn to outline some of those our proposals.
Yeah, so we intend to introduce a private members' bill that will strengthen the powers granted to the courts and the South African Police Service to provide essential safeguards and make sure that the rights of the society's most vulnerable are protected. Our private members' bill will address legislative gaps and shortfalls and will have due regard to innovative measures introduced in other countries where such measures have proven track record of success and can be adapted for the South African context. 9 key proposals will be included in this private members' bills. Firstly, changing the terminology that is used in the legislation to make it more inclusive by adding to domestic violence, domestic abuse. This recognizes that not all abuse are violent and that the threshold for receiving protection does not in fact require an act of physical violence to have taken place. Secondly, drafting the substantive chapters of the bill in plain English, non-legal English, to make the bill more accessible. Ordinary South Africans that do not have legal qualifications must be able to read the legislation and understand their rights and the process that they should follow to obtain protection, without first needing to consult with a lawyer at great expense. Although the plain English movement has had support in the South African legal sector for years now, it's not yet resulted in legislation being drafted in plain English, and we hope that this bill can set a precedent in that regard. Thirdly, providing for a single defined process of applying for and obtaining an order from the courts protecting against various forms of interpersonal and domestic abuse that may even include acts of bullying or stalking. Fourthly, ensuring the speedy service and enforcement of protection orders through alternative means in order to ensure that victims are immediately provided protection after a protection order is granted. This is to avoid lengthy delays that often result from backlogs and the lack of capacity at the South African police services. The fifth proposal, directing the Minister to issue rules that guide the process to be followed by the court, including what the burden of proof will be and how evidence will be filed and submitted. Currently, there are many grey areas as far as the court procedure is concerned, and this has resulted in inconsistent application across different courts and provinces and between different presiding officers. Number 6, ensuring that court staff dealing with matters of domestic abuse are properly trained and experienced, and legally trained court officials are made available to assist parties in a case, particularly where one or both of the parties are not legally represented, in order to ensure that nobody's rights are unduly infringed on. Number 7, placing a duty on all legal practitioners to act as a point of first contact for victims of abuse by advising them on their basic rights and remedies without charging for this consultation. Number 8, creating a central online register of domestic violence court orders and applications to ensure that a court in one city or town can easily access an order granted by a court in a different city or town. And finally, number 9, creating specific offences for those who, in either a grossly negligent manner or with intent, fail to assist victims of domestic abuse and violence in accordance with the duties placed on them by the Act.
Hand over to Mama French and Bombo to deal with that aspect.
Of course, there is no substitute of good policing, and this is something that the government can make it work right away. I got reminded of the 3 cases that I have to follow as a DA Women National Leader. One is that of Janika Mello, where days, I think probably 3 or 4 days, where the evidence was still lying there in Mitchell's Plain. I saw it myself, where it wasn't even picked up, even although that we called now and again the investigation officer. I got reminded of a case in Stellenbosch, in Klapmats, where a lady has to, from Klapmats to Stellenbosch, when she went to the Klapmats police station, was told that they don't have the DNA rape kits, so must go to the hospital. Getting reminded of a 3-year-old in Khayelitsha recently, where the mother was sent from pillar to post, from the Harare to the Lingale to, and all of those, where you'll find that the police didn't have much of what knowing what they're supposed to do. So policing in South Africa needs to return to the basics. We need to ensure that there are adequate rape kits so that DNA samples of offenders can be taken, that the front house of the police officers are trained to deal with sexual offences case in a professional and sensitive manner, and that they are equipped with the necessary victim-friendly rooms to interview sexual offence survivors in. I've been to in most all parts of the country, in Limpopo, in the KZN, where there are victim empowerment units. They are actually roomed in a small room where even the officers cannot be able to go to the communities in order to follow up with the victims. We also need to increase the number of detectives that are able to investigate sexual offences and bring the perpetrators to book, because it's no use to talk about their conviction if the evidence is not collected properly and is not being brought, because you find that the case now will be thrown out of court if now there are no detectives or those who are skilled enough to collect the evidence.
The DA intends to have the first draft of this bill tabled before the end of this parliamentary session this year, and we implore the government, if it's serious about dealing with these issues, especially the Department of Justice and for Parliament itself, to stand with us and the women and children of South Africa to provide us with the cooperation in this particular issue. And to this end, we will be writing to the Speaker in terms of the Joint Rule 216 of Parliament to fast-track the processing of this legislation as soon as it is ready to be introduced. This will then enable the Joint Programming Committee to dispense with any joint rules that may impede the prompt passage of this bill through Parliament. It will also significantly shorten the time periods relating to legislative processes surrounding the bill. The DA believes that the government has shown inaction on this issue for far too long. The disbanding of the very units that should have been addressing this problem over the course of a decade have done irreparable harm to the fight against violence against women and children in South Africa. We believe that public sentiment has now reached boiling point, and it is time for this Parliament and for this government to act. Thank you very much. I'll take any questions that anyone has. If you would identify your media house and your name and who you'd like to put your question to. Who's first? Lindsay? I volunteered you.
Just in terms of tomorrow's debate, are you putting this proposal on the table tomorrow? Why not? Why didn't you just wait until do this tomorrow, or how does this process flow from here?
Well, what we want to do is to make sure that what is announced tomorrow is not more virtuous ends that we've seen so often in this current administration, where you have a big PR announcement with very little substance. What we want to do is to issue a challenge to the President and to the governing party that if you're really serious about dealing with this issue, here are 9 concrete proposals that you can do relatively quickly that would make a big difference in addressing this in terms of the... We've heard all sorts of things that the President has up his sleeve for tomorrow, but we need to move beyond government by announcement. We need to move to a government that is putting in legislative steps to address this particular problem. So this stands now as a challenge to the President tomorrow. These are 9 concrete proposals that you can use. Join us and let's address this problem. Let's get serious about it.
Hi, John Babalo here from EWM. Your private members' bill will be ready by when?
Werner, well, we hope to have it drafted soon, but Werner will give you the time frames on it.
Yeah, look, we hope to introduce it to Parliament before the end of this year. The next parliamentary term or quarter will be a bit longer, I think about 11 weeks, so hopefully before the end of this year. Then.
And just to follow up to that, you've got the 9-point plan. It's not the same as the President's plan.
We know the points in our plan.
As far as the President's pronouncements at his televised national address, some of the statements he's released on these legislative proposals that he wants, tightening of certain acts, like sexual offences, the registry. Are you satisfied with what he's undertaken,
well,
the President? Which they're not all the same. You've got a bit more than he does, but what he's put forward, is that satisfactory for you?
Well, it's not so much what he's putting forward. It's about what happens with those proposals. We have sexual offences registers. They are unpopulated. They're unupdated. We have all these virtuous ends announced. We don't have any concrete steps. So what I think it's important tomorrow is for the President, in one take, not two, to tell us what he intends to do to address this issue. We've got some ideas. We've got actually far more proposals than this. We've spent a number of weeks putting together some really good ideas that we believe will form the core of this private members' bill. But these certainly are the bull points that we believe would make an immediate difference in addressing it. But certainly what the President also needs to do tomorrow is move beyond the theoretical and get down to brass tacks about what he intends to do to overhaul the South African Police Service. The South African Police Service at the moment is the most untrusted of all state institutions. And it's obviously there's a big problem there. The crime statistics that were released last week show we're not winning the war on crime, quite the opposite. The criminals are gaining the upper hand. And so one of the things the President can do immediately is announce an overhaul in the SAPS and its management, in the structures and the resourcing of it. Because as the MEC has said, there is no legislative substitute for good police work. The biggest deterrent to gender-based violence in South Africa is the assurance that if you commit a crime against a child or a woman, that you will be caught, you will be arrested, you will be prosecuted, and you will be convicted. And when you are convicted, you will spend time in jail. That is the biggest deterrent to crime and particularly gender-based violence in South Africa. Without that, legislative steps remain just words on paper. So I think the President needs tomorrow to really come out significantly with a key plan about what the SAPS, who are at the front line of this, are going to be doing to address the issue. The moment they're not trusted, many elements of them are unprofessional. Many women who seek support from the SAPS at station level are turned away, told that it's private family matters they mustn't come and bother the police with. We know the drama that the DA was able to expose around the lack of rape kits. I mean, how do you deal with gathering evidence when you don't even have a rape kit at a police station? These are basics that the President needs to fix before announcing virtuous ends. Yes, sir.
Sorry, Mwandi Gadahu, Cape August. I'm just wondering, how long did it take you to come up with these proposals? How long did it take you to come up with them?
The office has been working on these proposals for about 4 to 5 weeks. Obviously, it's something Dawn, our DA Women's Network, has been championing and working at far longer than that, but we've started to solidify it into a legislative action step, obviously in reaction to the growing public anger and the public appetite for us to do something. But Norma French, do you want to talk a little bit more about
just to add that it's part of the DA manifesto for the 2019. But specifically now, we're dealing with the issue of the legislation. As we know that gender-based violence is multifaceted, so it needs a multi-pronged approaches, which is inclusive. For example, the issue that we are suggesting for the Domestic Violence Act and also the Protection from Harassment Act to have one, because almost 60% of these is interpersonal violence. It's a intimate partner violence that is happening. So it's difficult for someone who has been harassed and abused to report or get even a protection order vis-a-vis for the one who has been had a clap and whatever, all of those. That's why we're saying that no matter how small, whatever type of the abuse or the violence, that's why we're adding those, it needs to be reported. But I think what John is stating is that we cannot allow secondary victimization, because it gives now that ordinary person who will want to report will say, what's the use? Because anyway, no one will make a follow-up on it. We have seen the research where it shows that actually 3% in terms of the conviction rate. So why would the people even report? But also in addition to that, it's about how to make the point that the criminal justice system is ready. Because we hear of the cases where the women, they don't even know the investigation officers. We hear, for example, Jekels in the East London, the boxer, the lady, had an interdict, but he was killed, although he had an interdict. So how do we ensure that legislatively the system is strong, especially the criminal justice system? Of course, the issue, if you see the preamble, it talks about men should take responsibility. Of course, not all men, but the majority. So it's men who kill these women, it's men who rape these women, and so forth. Hence now we want to do all of this legislatively, plus also we have to focus, as now I'm talking as a government, on the primary drivers in terms of the economy, women exposure, to employment, the safety, which is, I think, on Thursday, the provincial government will come up with a provincial safety plan where it's also going to be more comprehensive. It's not only about the issue of the policing, but the social determinants as well.
Marianne Merton?
Yes. Daily Maverick. Question to Ms. Sheikh. Is this...
Sharif.
Sharif, sorry. These 9 points, are they enough for you? You stood up on the 3rd of September and made quite a strong statement. Your written statement reflected at least an awareness and a slightly different attitude to what the older people in your party might take when you spelled women WOMXN.
Correct.
You were named as one of the 4 who had proposed some more radical actions than holding up posters in the National Assembly. I mean, these 9 points, they don't talk about LGBTI community, they don't talk about, I read them very quickly. Is this enough for you and people in your party who may have a younger perspective?
Thank you for that question. Thank you for that question, and you're correct. I do spell woman with an X. And the reason why we spell it with an X is to ensure inclusivity for women of color and those who identify as women, because you need to remember that trans issues are a very big issue that we need to deal with. In terms of these 9 points, I think it's a very good start. And I'm in full support of it. And I think that we as parliamentarians and we as the DA, we have to start somewhere. And sure, I know if I had a magic wand, I would swing it and ensure that something happens much quicker and in a much effective and efficient way. But I do believe that these 9 points are a very good start. But of course, as time goes, nothing's ever written in stone. And they can be looked at and, does it work, doesn't it work, and what can we do to make it better? And I think for us in the DA, I have a mantra that says, if we want to see something different, we have to change. We have to make a step forward. And I think that this is the better step than the president is taking. Because if you guys didn't know, the president speaks about the National Council against gender-based violence and femicide. They speak about the National Strategic Plan, but he doesn't tell you that this is not budgeted for and not resourced. So it's great to have things on paper and to speak to people and make great promises, but if you don't put your money where your mouth is, then you're just doing a lip service.
Jan and then Paul Gettialto.
Can you just elaborate on the measures that will be taken to ensure that protection orders are because I think that's a problem with people are
coming on there.
Sure, Paul.
So protection orders, they're not worth the paper they're written on. A protection order is served on someone, and it's like a red flag to a bull. And there's no way the police have got the resources to protect everyone with a protection order. So following on Jan's question, how are you going to go along and strengthen and make those protection orders serious for people?
Yeah, well, look, I think firstly, part of the weaknesses in the current system, and you're quite right, about 60% of interim orders are ultimately scratched, deleted, because the victims do not return to court. And the research show that one of the primary reasons for that is then further intimidation. We're of the view that certain specific legislative instruments can assist to make protection orders stronger. For example, placing an absolute duty on the police to act within a specific period on an interim order, to also, for example, do a search and seizure in respect of dangerous weapons, specifically firearms. An absolute duty on the police already, as well as clerks of court, to ensure that victims are aware of alternatives in terms of ensuring their immediate safety. For example, research also showed that there's a huge failure to inform victims of their right to be temporarily housed in shelters. We talk about the fact that not in most instances are the emergency financial instruments that's already a possibility within the Act made use of to assist victims financially in order to ensure that they don't have to maintain a physical presence in necessarily the home where the abuse took place. And if we, through legislative means, can address all of those issues, interim protection orders and final protection orders may just turn out to be a stronger measure of assisting victims.
Great. Anybody else got anything further?
solution. In some in some quarters there were calls for the death penalty to come. Is something that you have
Yeah. Well, as you would know, the DA, as a Liberal party, doesn't believe in the death penalty, but we do allow members a vote of conscience on that particular matter. The problem in South Africa is that you've got to catch the criminals before you can hang them, and we're not catching or convicting, and that is the problem. It speaks to the point that Norma French and Mbombo made around the basic policing not being done. And when you look at the conviction rate, the 3% conviction rate, is it really a deterrent? Is it really going to make a big difference? As I said, I don't believe there's a substitute for good, solid police work where people know there are consequences, where you commit a crime, you will be arrested, you will be charged, you will be convicted, and you will spend time in jail. There will be a consequence. I think that the court in various cases have expressed themselves on the constitutionality of the death penalty, and I think it's going to be a very difficult road to pull back from that. But obviously, it's a debate that is going to continue to rage in South Africa the longer we have unacceptably high crime levels, which are just simply not being addressed through an unprofessional, unfunded, under-resourced police service and a justice system that simply can't keep up with the caseload.
Follow up
Sure.
quickly, John. The MEC mentioned social determinants as being an underlying factor in some of this abnormal antisocial behavior by men against women. What are some of these social determinants, and how does this affect addressing this?
I think she touches part of it in terms of the toxic masculinities, how you respond to such. I think she asked a question about her view about the approach. So the issue of some activism and advocacy that is happening among the women's group in terms of occupying certain space to disrupt certain space is a cry out for help, although it might not substitute the policing and the system and the legislation. So there are parts of it where, as I'm saying, that in terms of the toxic masculinities, in terms of how from boys to men being raised, where the neglect of some children by the parents themselves, where it ended up, but we are not saying that as South African, whether you are a child or you are a woman, that you cannot walk at night just because you are afraid. You cannot be policed in terms of when and where just because of that. So whoever is an abuser must take responsibility. So that's why I made an example that in the Western Cape, we are going to announce some of these safety plans where it will be a multi-pronged so that to tackle some of these kind of the issues. Also, we do know that in some aspects, you'll find that as I always say, that women gender-based violence has got no face. It doesn't discriminate, whether you are highly educated or not. But you'll find that there are intersectionalities where some groups of women ended up being more exposed than the rest, especially when there's a high crime rate and so forth. So in some aspect of it, in terms of the interventions to curb the violence, there will be part of it. But in this space, we want to focus on the legislative, because if you don't have, let's make an example, and when I made an example of the Harassment Act, there are women who are not necessarily being abused as part of the domestic violence, but in the workplace, in terms of the sexual harassment, where the laws are not tight, or other women generally. But how do we ensure that there is a protection orders around that space where you have now both of these through one bill that will be introduced to curb such of those? So it's as I indicated, it's multifaceted, and then someone mentioned about, I think it's you, that even some of them will find that actually they might have their own personality disorders, as evidence show that when there's an exposure of fetal alcohol syndrome, you ended up having a child or an adult who ended up not being able to differentiate between right and wrong. Hence, from the health perspective, we always talk about the first 1,000 days, the first 2 years of a child's life. That's when 80% of the brain is growing. But it's not an excuse. We are not saying that you could be able to do that because of those, but we are saying that let's look at the whole of this holistically. Men taking responsibilities as men, women also encouraging them to speak up, as I made an example earlier, that through the physical violence, anyone can be able to see that you have been beaten, and then without even explaining yourself, they'll ask you, how dare, what happened? Without even actually responding, already they'll fight for your cause, that how dare he did that. So somehow there might be a healing process. But when you have been sexually violated, we have been raped, nobody sees the wound, it's inside. That's why some of them will only open up after 20 or 40 years. But now when you create those safer spaces of where women can speak out, where in that kind of a space, it makes them to be able to relieve and show that wound. And then it becomes a collective that we are with you, sister. So we have to look at all of those. But as legislators, as parliament, we do have a responsibility to come up with the laws that will make some of these to be able to be realized, not only focusing on this on the social activism and so forth.
I'd like to add to that answer. And I feel like I just need to be straight up, and I hope many South Africans are watching. We are a violent society, and the crime stats shows that we are a violent society. And some of the social deterrence is, and a lot of people has been speaking about it, is men standing up in those private spaces where they don't usually stand up to call out other men. You see, it's good. It's not enough for you to tell me that you are a good man. It's not enough for you to tell me that. What you as good men have to do is tell those other men how to be good men. Because when we raise boys that don't know how to deal with their emotions, and I spoke about this in my speech, when we raise them not to know how to deal with it, it is women when they grow up that have to deal with their toxicity and how they deal with their emotions. So that's one of the things that we have to really focus on. And I'm speaking to young people now who have kids, who are bringing boys up and girls up in this society, to do it differently, to change gender norms. And, you know, too often we're stuck in this gender norms of boys must be a certain way and girls must be a certain way, that we create a society of unequal. We create it. So we have to have the ability to, to take it apart and make it different. When you're at a braai, when you're in those group WhatsApp chats that men are on, and you send pictures of girls and you speak about what you're going to do to them, if you had the opportunity, you need to speak out in those groups and you need to say something. When you're at a braai and your uncle is telling you and your uncle is making moves to your younger cousin, you need to stand up and you need to do something, because if we continuously say that this is a family matter and we're dealing with it as a family, we're not going to make any changes. So we all have to take responsibility, including in this room.
Anybody else? Got any final questions?
Just to indicate that the DA does have a manifesto that talks about gender inequality inclusive of LGBTIQ. It is there. The DA also has got a sexual harassment policy. I think that's the only party that has since 2018. So we in some other spaces, we are doing a lot of the other stuff.
Yeah. And to just say, I mean, just to close off and say thank you for being here. But of course, this is a step. There's a variety of different actions and steps and levers that need to be used. As parliamentarians, we believe this is what we can do in terms of this legislative space to be able, and in this arena, to be able to start making a difference and start changing the laws. So, it's a process, and there's a variety of actors, and Parliament is one of them, and it's time now for it to step up and act. Thank you for your time this morning, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you.
Well done.
It's like before we die. What is the cake breaking news at the end? How are you? I don't know.
Tomorrow, Alan's coming as well.
I did not want to be you are old, considering I'm significantly older than you.
I thought you did well.
No, guys, let's try that in another
I'd like to very way down there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I didn't know that.
every year, well, I'm not up for this chain now.
Is that why you're sitting?
Quite some fun.
Not as far. We're doing a bit of trail. And then trying to get on the